First of all, I'd like to thank you for the scientific committee of this LAMIS meeting. I'm very happy to be chosen as the introduction, to make the introduction of Professor Heckman. First of all, he's a very good friend of the region. He's been visiting and us for a long time, influencing through many students, and we're very thankful for him for that. But I have to make his scientific contributions, and I'd like to. It's impossible to make even a simple resume of his so vast and so broad. Professor Heckman, he Nobel laureate, as you know, and he's being awarded for his work as the founder of microeconometrics and correction for sample bias and so forth. And but this is the history of economic thought. That's already well known, and that's well absorbed in our profession and all textbooks and practices and everything. I'd like to concentrate more the second part of his work, that his work in early childhood. And perhaps he deserves a second Nobel Prize for that. And he's going deeper and deeper in the subject, more intensive and more intensive. He's not only an economist anymore, only an economist. He's an economist and an interaction with other science. And it's just fantastic for us. So we should honor him for his past work, but we should pay close attention to this region for his current work, because it's going to the details how to go about early childhood, and it is so rich for us that it's hard to find anybody else that is as important as him. Let me describe a little bit. I'm very lucky because I know Professor Heckman for a long time. Actually, he's been visiting much the region, and there was in the LACEA a meeting in the region that he came. And then he got the Nobel Prize while in Rio, so that was fantastic for us. And then we had the opportunity to commemorate with him. And then he's been coming many times since then. And I'm talking a little bit more about how the influence in early childhood, particularly in Brazil and in the region. One of his main findings is that whatever there is in terms of inequality in education by the year 4, inequality in terms of parents' education, parents' income, it persisted along the life of the student life. So the schooling system, that's data for the US, doesn't correct the inequality that exists at the age of 4. So that's very disturbing for a region like us, ours, that's so much inequality and so poor education in general. And he's been working in specific ways of changing that, and is examining carefully this work, this experience in the US, the Perry School, and then the Head Start, and so forth. And then he found that that it could have extremely influence in early development of children. And that's very precious for us because it gives some hope to intervene and to improve things and diminish inequality, diminish income inequality, racial inequality. Has a beautiful little article, so many, it's impossible, talking about how much is much better to do this instead of quotas, and so is a very. We organize in Brazil several meetings, and then is with multidisciplinary psychologists, neuroscientists, and he went over all these different fields and come to the same conclusion from different angles that the intervention had to be done in a very early stage. And and also has found something very interesting that from the cognitive, you cannot do much later on, but for non-cognitive, you can still hope to do something later on. So just these two extremely important policy message, so important for the region. And I'm very happy that he's coming again. And thank you very much for doing all this year. And I stop here because I don't want to compete.
Oh, you can give the talk. So I want to thank you very much. Aloisio is an old friend, and it is true that I've come to the region many times, and both directly to LACEA and LAMA's meetings, but to other meetings as well, like the meeting you described in Rio, and a series of meetings in Sao Paulo, and then other parts of the region as well, looking at this question which is going to be the title of my talk. I could view this as kind of an ongoing research agenda, and it keeps changing as I keep learning more, and I want to summarize this. It is, technically, I'm the president of the Econometric Society this year. My term ends in December. We had a productive meeting earlier today about with the Regional Council of the Econometric Society in Latin America, and I'm very hopeful and very positive about every development that's occurred. I can simply say this: I've been coming to the region for many, many years. I remember coming to some great meetings here in Mexico in 1982, I think it was initially, that I came, and the meetings there were very high quality, but consistently I've learned a lot, and there's been a tremendous amount of interaction and improvement. And I guess the one thing that's happened in the region that just wasn't there to the same extent that it is now is the database and the possibility of looking at micro data and looking at empirical research on a range of questions, including poverty. So let me, I definitely grateful, okay, I guess I should put this out here. I'm very grateful for the opportunity then to speak and talk to you for a bit, and I hope we have some time for questions and so forth. So let me just lay out a fact that is something that that I find extremely interesting in the literature. I cite Salvador, among others, in this, but it's a large literature that's been found by many different people with many different econometric and empirical models, that if we start looking at measures of lifetime inequality, what we find is that there is some fairly substantial evidence that early life factors, and I'm talking about before 18, play a huge role in explaining a lot of lifetime inequality. And so this has been achieved through many, many different ways, and I think it's exciting, and it provides a basis for understanding. But the question is, what do we make out of it? And you know, I don't think this is challenged much, but what policy responses are appropriate? And what I want to talk about today is something that's very important in the region, and that's on inequality and social mobility. And I'll show you a few statistics in a minute. But the question is, how do we focus and conceptualize inequality and social mobility? And how do we relate this to the studies of the economics of the family? It's very hard for anybody thinking about social mobility and inequality not to realize the family plays an important role. But what aspects of the family play an important role? And that's what I want to talk about. And so what we see, and this is something that you've seen versions of, the so-called Gatsby curve, or Great Gatsby curve, that Alan Kruger popularized last year when he was in his when he was advising President Obama, but this is work that Miles Korak and many others have been doing over many, many years. And if you look at this measure of intergenerational mobility, a lot of econometric and statistical questions that emerge, but here is a graph that actually compares this intergenerational elasticity, this is beta right on the top of that graph, to long-run measures of income in one generation in terms of income of the parents. And what you see is a relationship that has been noted on many occasions, but it's interesting to look at. I put Mexico here on the graph. You can see that the inequality coefficient in terms of Gini, going from left to right, you see a relationship, but you also see that as you go up in terms of inequality, this beta, which is really a measure of immobility, the higher the measure of beta, the more likely family origins are in explaining what lifetime income is, that also is very positively correlated. And so the question is, what do we make out of this? And you can see that countries like Chile, Brazil, I mean, it's, you know, this is a regression line across many heterogeneous countries, but nonetheless, it is the case that even after we look at after-tax income and transfers, we see a very strong relationship. And the question is, what do we make of it? Now, when we look at this curve, it has the common problem, which many, many labor economists, many people in this room have worried about, and it basically focuses on income as the measure of inequality. But we also know that when we think about inequality, it's really multidimensional. And we want to know what aspect, what does income stand for? And we know it stands for many different things. Is it income per se? Does it have to do with genes? Obviously, genes is not much of an argument here. Going across countries, you don't think the genetic arguments are all that different here across different countries, although there are different heterogenees in terms of ethnic groups and compositions of the workforce that may contribute. Do we think it's low parenting ability, an inability to borrow? That's what a lot of economists have worried about, credit market constraints. And it's received a huge amount of attention in the literature. It's in some sense the standard. It's a kind of an occupational hazard in some sense, because we know how to analyze credit constraints, so we do that because we do it well. But the question is, empirically, how important is this compared to other sources? Other more recent explanations have been parental knowledge and then parental preferences. So there's a range of questions which this graph leaves silent. And that also has a counterpart to what exactly should be the appropriate policy response if we want to promote, say, income mobility across generations. Some people have read this to say income transfer per se is going to promote more social mobility. And I would argue, based on the American experience, that's not true. And we did change the war on poverty in the 1960s, that the effects on intergenerational mobility were very muted, if they were positive at all. So there's a lot of work on this, and people probably have seen lectures or papers on papers by Gary Solon, who summarizes work by Gary Becker and Nigel Tomes. And that framework is really a very rich framework. It's stimulated a lot of empirical work, and it has kind of some obvious implications, but important ones. Heritability goes up, then the intergenerational elasticity goes up, so less mobility. As the efficiency of parental investment goes up, then parental origins play a bigger role. So beta goes up. That's another finding. As inequality itself goes up, beta goes up. So again, and then of course if inequality in public provision of investment goes up, beta goes up. So the question is though, what do we make out of this? And you get a very close, and out of these steady state versions of these models, you get a very close relationship between the beta and the actual steady state level of inequality that justifies this. But what I want to do is step back from this relationship, or at least try to supplement what we know about the relationship in terms of some recent work. And I want to review some work on dynamic overlapping generation models that have features of looking at multi-period versions of life cycle models, where we consider the life cycle of the child and the life cycle of the parent having multiple periods. We want to have richer models of skill formation. I think many people, when they think about human capital, even to this day, and my guess is in many of the surveys, and most people think about education as being a principal component, and it is, but also when you're thinking about measures of ability, usually cognitive ability, IQ. And one of the findings that's emerged in a large body of work that has been going actively now for the last 10 years or so, 8 to 10 years, has been that these other traits, these non-cognitive traits that Aloisio talked about, social and emotional skills, the ability to regulate, the ability to stay on task, these are very important in terms of predicting outcomes in lifetime. And they actually have a different kind of elasticity and malleability over the life cycle. And so they offer another kind of opportunity. So even in terms of measuring programs, you want to focus on something more than just PISA scores or achievement test scores, which is what so much of the focus is on, not only in Latin America, but in the US and in Europe. But also we want to think, when we think about interventions, thinking about interventions that look upon these multiple skills. I want to show you a little bit about the empirical relevance of these observations. So I want to build a very simple theoretical framework that abstracts from a lot The underlying literature is richer than what I'm going to describe today, so I'm giving only the most elementary versions, but I want to try to convey the essence of it. So they're much richer formal frameworks, but in a popular lecture, nobody wants to hear too much about the details, and we do have appendices which go through this. So I'm going to give you some details, but it's going to be fairly simple, I think. So the central concept, though, is its capabilities. This is an idea that's been around for skills, if you want to think about it, but skills defined more broadly, not just about the ability to, say, fix a car or do a certain task in the labor market, but to manage yourself, the ability to organize one's activities, to focus, to plan. And these are capabilities that, in a broader sense, enable people to act. And so let me just summarize a list of findings. And this is a list of findings. This is kind of like an ongoing list that I keep updating and keep revising. But let me just summarize these very briefly and then try to build a model that integrates features of these and showing you which features you think are very important. So the very first topic and the very first thing is when you think about human performance, you really want richer measures of skills. You really don't want to just focus on achievement tests or IQ tests. I don't know how many people, I don't know, does anybody have a guess about what the R squared is of IQ in an earnings equation, say for US data? Anybody know? Many people say like 50%, 40%. I won't ask Salvador, but does anybody know off the top, would guess, hazard a guess? 35%. No, it's more like 4%, 3%. Very small. So it's important. But the point is we fixate on things that we know. And I think these other capacities are in many tasks as important, if not more important. So that's one important fact that's going to play a big role. Second, and this is something that Aloisio is referring to, and this is something that I've noticed, many people have noticed, but it's startling. And I'll just show you, review some very familiar, now I hope familiar looking graphs, that these capabilities, gaps between individuals are opening up very early. And typically they open up before formal schooling starts. And that's something that actually wasn't fully appreciated. Certainly in the United States, people thought, what we could do is if individuals, schools take over at age 5 or 6, there are huge gaps that emerge before entry into school, and these capabilities open up early for both these cognitive and non-cognitive skills. This graph I've shown many, many times. I'm sorry if I'm boring you with repetition, but it's a very striking graph because what it shows, this is just a pure correlation now, but it's showing that if you look at kids and you follow them with longitudinal data, starting at age 3 to age 18, you really can't make accurate numbers before age 3. But what you can do is you can see a standard relationship that children from more educated parents have higher test scores. That's very well established. So that's just the finding. So you look at age 18 when these ability measures typically matter a lot for who goes in college and who isn't. This is a very big gap here. But you'll notice that the gap that's there at age 18 is pretty much there by age 5 or age 3. And that's kind of an important exhibit. And we get this also for other measures of social and emotional skills. This is now in inverse order. Antisocial behavior, not a good thing, and inversely ordered to the family income position. So we look at these data, and then we ask, what do we make out of this in terms of public policy? I mean, you could say a lot of different things about these graphs. I mean, one possible interpretation is this is a genetic manifestation. The dumb people have dumb kids, and they actually they have bad jobs and don't get educated. So all you're doing is passing on the genes. I want to try to dissuade you of that, but it's very much in the public domain. People are still arguing that ferociously. It's still a part of the argument. But I want to show that there's a powerful role for experience and interventions. The third point I want to make is that family structures play a huge role. And I think this should be troubling phenomena because this is true not just in the United States, not just true in Europe, but some data here on Mexico, which I build off on some work I gave the Bank of Mexico some 3 or 4 years ago. But if you look, for example, just at the pattern that's going on in Mexico, and there are parallel developments all throughout Latin America and throughout the world. The levels vary, but it is true that the pattern is going, that you're finding the kind of, quote, traditional marriage relationship is typically is declining somewhat. What you're finding is that children born in traditional environments measured in various ways, female-headed households have grown tremendously over the last 20, 25 years. And there are various measures of disadvantage. Percentage of households headed by a female, not married, and a lot of these are into poverty status. So there's a very serious issue, percentage of children living in poverty. This is partly related to family status. So family status makes a big role. This is the counterpart for this in the United States, where we see there's also been a tremendous growth. My understanding is in Chile, certainly true in Taiwan, and many other countries where I've looked at this. There's been a growth in single parenting, and what's more, single parenting of a common exposed variety, where what you're getting is a structure of lack of parental input in the sense that you only have one parent rather than two, lower income, fewer resources, and that looks like it could create serious problems, something I've written about, many people have written about. Now, what we can also see when we look at these data, that we also see counterparts in what these family environments do. None of this is a causal story yet, not even close. All I'm doing now is just saying, okay, looking at what the relationships are. But for example, this is something that's been made the circles for years, but if you look at children born in different environments, and these are now American children, U.S. children, I should say, but they're born in different statuses, welfare, working class, professional, that partly correlates with those measures of family status, those trends that I showed going on. What you can actually see is that the children in the welfare families are typically in a typical hour getting like 616 words per hour that they hear. Professional families, 2,000 words in each hour. And also, importantly, the nature of the parent-child interaction is very, very different. It's very different in the sense that you have more affirmatives in the professional families and more prohibitions in the less professional families. So the structure of the parenting relationship has changed. And this is something I want to talk about because in building models to think about this. So, but anyway, in creating some of those gaps in terms of those achievement test gaps opening up at age 3, you actually will see you'll see something like the difference in the actual words achieved. The accomplished vocabulary will be the difference between 1,000 words, a little more than 1,000 words, and 500 words, 2 to 1, big ratio. In fact, there's a very large movement in the United States called the 30 million word gap. People, these are all advocacy groups, but they basically integrate this up, so I can multiply by the number of years the child has been at home. And more recently, there's been a study in Science magazine showing that these actually vocabulary gaps open up even earlier than at age 3, and even with somewhat larger samples and so forth. So there's a fairly big literature hinting anyway that families matter. Now, one of the main findings, and there's been a lot of literature, a lot of popular talk, this is the genetic explanation, is that capacities are created by investments in environments. Genes are always a candidate on the table. If you look, for example, at the heritability estimates, you're getting something like 50% estimates from the behavioral genetics literature on just about everything. Goldberger showed once that heritability, the knowledge of French, was 70%, leaving you some doubt about what these heritabilities measure. But our heritability of knowledge of physics was 70%. But nonetheless, you do find that out there the genetic argument's important. But one thing that's been very exciting, and economists have participated in this, I participated on this to an extent, I'm not going to talk much about it, but summarize it, is that if we look, for example, at the role of how environments and genetic expression actually works, we see dramatic effects of experience, even on what we used to think of as just genes. Genes do nothing by themselves. Genes are only activated. They create proteins. They're energized by, and it's that protein production which matters. And it turns out that these patterns of experience matter. Let me just give you some very striking exhibits from the National Academy of Sciences article some 8 years ago now. But if you look at these coloration, these are heat maps of different SNPs in the genome. And these are for twins, who are identical twins. And the only thing you really need to understand is that these, if you look at one pair, so if you look at this pair on this column onto the, which is to your left, you're going to see that that this is a pair of twins, one side and the other side. They actually have the same DNA, but already at age 3 they have fundamentally different gene expression, suggesting that something happened along the way to modify their behavior. By age 50, the heat maps are very, very different. So the genes, the actual genetic material that's producing what we know genes do, inflammation, a whole set of other things, have been well studied, economists have been working on, play a huge role. So that's a hint, and there's a very large literature about epigenetics. I'm not going to talk much more about it. What we've also found, though, is compelling evidence for critical and sensitive periods in child development. And this is a stylized model. This goes back to work by Huttenlocher at the University of Chicago in the 1970s, Nelson and Thompson, and more recently this survey article by Barton. But there is some evidence in the neuroscience that there are these target periods where various aspects of the brain develop. It's not to say these things can't be developed later, not that there's not later substitution. In fact, that's one of the big economic questions. How much can you remediate for early disadvantage? Well, how good are the substitutes for early disadvantage? Non-trivial question, for reasons I'm going to get at. But this broad consensus is, yeah, in certain kinds of sensory perceptions, that the brain sensitivity to learning seems to crest in these different lenses, languages, higher cognition. We know, for example, that if children learn a second language, frequently they can learn the language without any accent if they actually are learning this before the age 11, roughly, and with other measures. So the point is that there is this notion of critical and sensitive periods. Early life conditions are important, but there's also evidence of resilience and subsequent recovery. And that's important because there's a non-trivial economic question. You target early, you wonder, well, how am I going to know whom to target? Should I make things universal? If I target later, after the problems emerge, you say, well, maybe it's too late. But on the other hand, you know you have a problem. So the question is what the efficient targeting would be. It's a non-trivial question. So what I want to suggest is, yes, there are methods of resilience and partial recovery which will actually work and can be effective. But if we think about different measures, different notions of what the skills are, cognitive and non-cognitive, these play substantially different roles in terms of their malleability. Adolescent interventions that target these non-cognitive skills have actually been quite effective. And that leads to a general theme about what is it about these interventions, what is it about these family environments, what is it about this whole common spectrum of interventions that's most successful. And that's what I want to come back to this. So it's not like it's all over at age 3. I mean, there are various advocacy groups always say 0 to 3 or 0 to 5 or something of the sort. It's very effective in politics, maybe. I'm not a politician, but I would say that we actually have other windows of opportunity, and we should build on those, and we shouldn't write off other people. So at later ages. And so what I think is important, though, is coming back to the credit constraint issue, which I want to address, is a lot of scholars in the recent literature have claimed to find important effects of family credit constraints, especially those that bind in the early years. And I want to suggest that at least in the developed country literature, that may not be as important as other interaction patterns, which I think are correlated. Again, there's always a lot of correlations moving around, but the importance of this parent-child, mentor-child relationships. And so I want to stress much more than the literature has stressed and suggest some economic models for incorporating this into the literature. So that's the plan. I've already used up most of my talk on the plan, so I'll tell you, I'll give you the website to read. But let me just talk very briefly, talk about, sketch some models. And I'm going to only take the focus of the simplest models. I want to lay out a basic framework and show how the frameworks have been extended. And then I want to show that this is an area that's actually very active. So I don't want to just talk about my work. I want to talk about a lot of work that's actually ongoing. Many of these papers have only been done in the last year. So some of the papers I'm going to talk about have been written in the last 6 to 8 months. And it's an active area of research. So I want to lay out the basic framework and its extensions. Secondly, I want to lay out an econometric framework. And so what this naturally suggests, in fact, the whole capabilities approach of Sen suggests, is what many people call a factor model, dynamic factor model. So nonlinear state space and factor models play a huge role. And I want to show you some evidence from those. Third, I want to discuss some of the evidence on credit constraints. And then I want to show you some of the empirical evidence about exactly what are the most promising interventions and how we can cast those into this theoretical framework. So let me lay out this basic idea. Capabilities. I already laid out the fact that capabilities and the technology of capability formation and life cycle human development. So capabilities we discussed already, but what I want to think about is that we have these capabilities. They, coupled with incentives and other constraints, map into a whole set of outcomes. So these capabilities theta are going to play a very big role. And so if you look at Amartya Sen's work on capability theory, and he sort of cast it into a framework that's more suited for econometric analysis and so forth. Is basically, you can think of it as a frontier production knowledge. What you're doing is essentially giving individuals maximum capacities to act in a number of situations. And so it really creates a notion of maximum flexibility. So agents will confront many different decisions in their lifetime. The question is, will they have the capacities to be able to indulge? It's not like you're shaping people to be a certain type. That's always the view. You know, this notion of Victorian notion, I want my little kid to save 15% each year or 15% each day of each activity, or I want him to behave in a particular way. It's not the notion. What you want to be able to do is create the opportunities of maximal choice sets. And James Foster has this very nice article on capability approach, really drawing on this Krebs's notion of creating maximum flexibility, of maximum opportunity. And so I see that in this framework. So capabilities play a huge role. The second essential ingredient is this technology of capability formation, where these capabilities map into future capabilities. So we have investments that are very broadly defined. And investments here would be not just a matter of reading to the child or sending the child to school, but it could consist of a lot of interactions that frequently get off not noticed. But there is a self-productivity effect, there is an investment effect, and then there's, let's say, a parental public good effect, which may be, in some minds, sort of maybe thought of, the second and third arguments may be hard to distinguish, but I want to think of the theta p as basically a recursive, as basically an environmental variable. And we know those, in almost any empirical studies, they play a huge important role empirically. So what I want to try to think of is a stage-specific technologies. And this technology already gets at the idea of stages of development. So you think of T as different stages of development in the child's life cycle. And one of the key ideas, and this is an idea I've been pushing for quite a while, but it's very important. And it's very simple from an economic standpoint to understand, but empirically it's been hard to document this, and I want to show you some estimates of this. So the one notion is complementarity. This notion, again, there's also a question of sign. You know, you want to normalize things so that they're, you know, a positive trait. So neuroticism or some schizophrenic disorder would not be something you would consider a positive trait. But if you have, like, you know, higher levels of IQ, higher levels of self-control and so forth, that one of the consistent findings that's been found, and this is like looking at rates of return to education for the most capable children, have typically been found to be very high. In the United States, some of the estimates have been as high as 20 to 25% per annum in highly motivated children, and in adult and adolescent years. But what's interesting is that the pattern of complementarity seems to change over the life cycle, that there seems to be more evidence. I'm using the word complementarity in a direct sense, kind of a Edgeworth sense, direct complementarity. But actually there's some evidence either that it's negative, there can be substitutability early on at some stages in the life cycle, or that the degree of complementarity early on is fairly small. Now what does complementarity find? And also what we find is that, this coupled with the fact that over the lifetime, a series of empirical studies are showing this complementarity relationship is actually increasing with the life cycle. So this is becoming stronger and stronger over the life cycle. These factors by themselves, this complementarity relationship, are really forces for disequalization. So if you're a social planner trying to maximize total output, this would suggest invest in the smartest, the best, the most able, and forget these people with low levels of capability. That's a powerful force. But what's been found in the literature is something that actually offsets this. And this is the notion of dynamic complementarity. And I'll show you some examples of this from both the empirical literature and just some theoretical simulations and some theoretical discussions. But the dynamic complementarity, very simple idea. Through this notion of self-productivity, what you get is you invest now, you create a bigger stock, and that actually says downstream you can actually make currently less productive investments more productive by essentially enabling them early on. So we think of these in one period models, as much of the literature did, the Becker, Tomes, Solon literature. These kinds of concepts completely vanish because everything is going to be one period, and if you invest more, it's going to be, you're going to get diminishing returns, and none of this notion about stage complementarity is there in that literature. But what's been found is increasing evidence of this dynamic complementarity, and this is a force for equalization. And so these kind of properties of the technology, just by themselves, without embedding them in any richer economic models, can explain a lot about why disadvantaged children why the advantaged children are the first to respond to opportunities. You know, we saw, for example, the returns to education went up in the United States. And you say, well, the most advantaged children took advantage of these higher returns. The less advantaged children did not. Now, you could say, well, that was a credit constraint. Well, what was also true, there was a capability constraint, that in many cases, even when the children were given free tuition, given a lot of payments, they didn't take advantage of it because they didn't see any benefit themselves from participating in that investment. So this can explain a lot of phenomena. I'll try to go through a fair amount of this. But so any complete economic model would bring in things of which we know much less, much less. It would be great if I could tell you we have this full body of knowledge. Here's the stack of papers. Now we're ready for the publication of the Encyclopedia of Human Development. We're actually still at a very early stage about understanding the role of family preferences and exactly what children are, so what the role of altruism is, the role of altruism versus paternalism. There's a lot of work being done on this. It's not so clear. And what exactly family resources are. So again, there's a notion that markets can't transfer easily, that you can't borrow. Parents of children cannot borrow against their future earnings. There may be restrictions on transfers within generations, parental liquidity constraints, and public provision of investment. These are all the kind of traditional notions. And then on top of it are the constraints on the parents, like the genes, the structure of the household, all of which have received a lot of attention. I wish I could say a lot more about this, and I'll talk around it. But the fact that these are active areas of research, and I'll try to delimit what this is. But if I just put together the capabilities and the technology, you get this very busy-looking chart, but it's basically just a flow chart, a graph, a simple graph, where essentially you say, okay, these investments, even prenatally, play a huge role. They feed into each other. The investments, the investment stocks, the environments are playing in, and then, of course, the role of preferences and constraints would feed into the actual level of investment that occurs in each child. But already this is telling you something which is important in the literature. There's a huge literature saying early life conditions matter and correlating. So Chinese famines, various kinds of adverse conditions. But clearly, when the point of view of understanding public policy, we want to know exactly what all the links are downstream. Was it really just the famine at age 3 years, or was it a series of other complementary or reinforcing events? And so that's kind of a sobering notion when we think about investment. So let me just lay out a sketch, just summarize a very bare bones model of, how much time do I have left?
Go ahead.
30
minutes. Yeah.
30 minutes, okay. So let me just sketch a very bare bones model that just kind of gets to the essence, and I can hint at where the literature is at. So the problem of the parent is going to be this is highly simplified. What I'm going to do is have 2-period lifetimes. So children are going to live 2 periods as children, and then they're going to grow up to adults, and then they're going to pass on, and so forth. So this is now a very simplified overlapping generations model. There are really much richer versions of this model, dynamic stochastic models under income uncertainty, and also uncertainty about child quality. But I'm going to consider only the simplest versions of these models. So I'm going to think about an initial capability level of the child drawn from a distribution, and I'm just going to use some notation to simplify. There are a lot of thetas going on around here, so I'm going to talk about the notation of the parent is basically H, and H prime is the child. So I'm going to simplify a lot of the notation. And I want to think about a very simplified technology, only because it helps me fix ideas. So I'm going to think about a technology at each stage where you have diminishing returns. So rho t here, this is a standard CES technology. Rho t is less than 1. And what you also see is share parameters, relative productivity. This is the self-productivity effect. This is the investment effect. And this is the parental environmental effect. So that's a very simplified parameterization. And those restrictions are standard in getting a CES. Now, we put that together, and let me suppose that I have a period in which childhood lasts 2 periods, adulthood lasts 2 periods. So it's a 4-period life cycle. And if I just adopt that particular technology and I make extreme simplifying assumptions, just to sort of get the main idea across, then what I can communicate is that the adult child, the child outcome, H prime, at the end of the 2 periods of childhood. It's going to be a function of H. It's going to be a function of these investments. But early investment has a direct effect through the self-productivity and also this indirect effect through the fact that it's promoting higher productivity in the second stage. So you pick up this multiplier, and that multiplier then is suggesting 2 reasons why you have early investment playing a big role. And this multiplier effect plays a big role. There are many more general models in the literature, and the econometric evidence I want to talk about arises. But this multiplier comes out of dynamic complementarity, and it captures the essence. So if, in fact, I didn't have the self-productivity effect, I didn't get the persistence, really, then basically investments would not accumulate, per se. So the investments accumulating and this dynamic complementarity play a big role. This is just an instance of it. This is not the model that I'm going to estimate or stay with. Now, we can also see, though, that if we look at phi equal to 1, so I'm going to take the simplest case where there's no, this returns, constant returns to scale, phi is equal to 1, then that's perfect complements, perfect substitutes. And that's the model that's actually driven much of the empirical literature to date, assuming the different periods in the life cycle are equally effective. But in fact, we know, and in fact, I want to try to convince you that that's not true. And if anything, if you want to think of what the polar opposite is, the polar opposite is actually this Leontief type technology, where what you get is that so this is an extreme case, obviously, where if I really get a Leontief technology, so I get perfect complements in that sense, that what I'm getting is that the investment that I make in the adult, the outcome of the child's skills, will actually be the min of the investments in the first period and the second period. And so that has some even though it's trivial, it's very important, I think. It's showing the dual face of complementarity. And what it's showing is that if you don't make an early base, in this extreme case, any subsequent remedial investment is not going to have any effect whatsoever. Literally. I mean, so that's the extreme. And nobody's saying that. But it's also true that any early investment can only be productive if some later investment's made. So it's not like this is an argument only for early investment. It's an argument really for the staging of investment. So empirically, between the perfect substitutes case and the case of perfect complements, I would argue the perfect complements case is actually far more important. I think that's important. So let me just sketch and then sort of trace out the literature. Let me write it down a parental utility function, of which we know very little, unfortunately. The discount factor, and then I'm going to talk about parental altruism, not paternalism, not for today. And C1 and C2 are consumption. And the child in the first few years of life is playing a very passive role. Child is just going to be invested in. And so some of the more interesting features is how you build a dynamic interaction between the parent and the child. I want to conclude talking about that. But let me just lay out this simple framework. So this is a very standard model, and this is very simplified to what's already in the published literature. Namely, we can imagine the value function of the parent is to maximize this valuation function, which consists of their own consumption in their 2 periods of adulthood, plus the valuation they place on the child's well-being. And so the altruism parameter here, this nu, and the discount parameter play a big role. And so this is the model that would actually be driving. And here I'm going to abstract from many sources of uncertainty, but we can easily accommodate those, and the literature does. And the standard budget constraint in this sense is then basically goods are the method of investment. We're going to invest in goods, and then the goods in the child, and then you're going to get a 2-period constraint. Each generation will leave a bequest to the next generation, and then that generation will go on and make a generation in the next period. And so we get these intertemporal budget constraints. And so in the absence of any credit market considerations, this is what you would get if W is the wage rate and H is the human capital of the child. So that's the kind of model. And if we take an illustrative technology along the line I was just looking at, so just the technology which has the CES technology, then basically what we come up with is we look at the ratio of early to late investments. That's going to be a function of what? It's going to be a function of the greater the share productivity, so the greater this investment multiplier, the greater the elasticity of substitution. I mean, not the elasticity of substitution, but this substitution parameter. The higher rho, the less the diminishing returns are, and the lower R. So all of that's I think, fairly straightforward and consistent with the literature. But what are the implications of this model? So this model is already an extension. It's in the literature. It's old. I don't want to talk about the old work except to set up the new work. So what we've seen, though, is that there's a lot of work where we can essentially build various constraints. The constraint that dominates much of the literature is the fact that parents can't borrow against the children's future resources. And there's a lot of evidence that that's there, but how important it is in explaining the variation is very much open for discussion. So let me just lay out a number of implications. It's clear, though, that if we have this technology of skill formation, and if we have less than perfect substitution, that the early life conditions can in principle influence the role of the child. Now, we also ask, what's the role, at least in terms of relative investments, of things like parental income, parental utility, or the magnitude of parental altruism if we have well-functioning credit markets? And the answer is no role whatsoever. If individuals can later invest, and there's no notion that the parental influence is playing that important, then you get this result that many people have talked about, Becker and Tomes talk about a lot, that parental influence doesn't matter. However, even in this model here, the very simple model here, even with perfect credit markets, if we give a role to the parents, human capital is playing a role in shaping the productivity of investment, even under that condition with perfect credit markets, it's not enough. Because then the stock of human capital that the child has will depend on itself, the child's stock of human capital, right? So even with perfect credit markets, you can't undo it because the parents themselves are an input into that production. And unless you can somehow insure against having a good parent or a bad parent, somehow insure against that parental environment, then no matter what the later remediation will be, there's going to be an effect of the early life conditions, even with full altruism and with perfect credit markets. So if we look at borrowing limitations, we can see substantial effects in terms of substantial literature claiming very strong effects. And again, the principal one being you really can't borrow against your child's future income. Okay, but now what's received attention much more in the recent literature is liquidity constraints within the lifetime of the parent. And the notion here is the parent faces a sequence of constraints at each stage of the life of the child. And so now, and again, I'm just simplifying, we can put all this into a truly richer stochastic framework. And there are models in the published literature that are doing this. But just to get to the essence, the parents now face a two-period constraint, right? They have to stay within their means, or they may have to stay within their means. They can't borrow against their future income, their own future income, not their child's future income. And so we get this sequence of constraints. And the interesting case is where the parent's income is itself growing, like with life cycle income. And that's a constraint that actually is, it has been observed. I mean, we are finding that constraint. And there's literature suggesting that there may be liquidity constraints in consumption and so forth. So that's a literature. And Flavio Cunha and I developed this model like 6 years ago. So I'm really just taking this from this approach. So we assume then that basically we can't borrow, A is greater than or equal to 0, they can't borrow against their own future income, and investments are not perfect substitutes. Then even in this simple world, and this is reviewing previous results, that the ratio of investments now will depend in general on whether the family is constrained. But what's interesting about this model, even though it's attracted a lot of attention, there's some recent work by Lochner and Kalkut looking at saying up to 60% of the families are constrained. This is quite an unusual constraint. It's a constraint that actually is focused on people who have growing income profiles. This isn't a constraint about absolute income. This is a constraint about saying, gee, these people have much higher income levels, and they will have, and they can't borrow against it, so their level of Mercedes will be lower than it might be otherwise, and depends on their trade-off. And so what we show here, and this is the 2007 paper with Flavio, that if we have then, like, if parents are very patient, and if they have a lot of intertemporal substitution, so if lambda is equal to 1, say, so that basically then the consumption is linear, then basically it doesn't matter. You're still going to get back to optimal investment ratios, even when you have these liquidity constraints. And then the trade-off is the notion between this phi, the substitution in technology, and this lambda, which is in preferences. And in the literature, these parameter estimates have been found, and suggesting, yeah, there's some evidence for borrowing constraints. But what I want to try to argue more generally is that in this particular case, this constraint is not necessarily synonymous with a low level of investment. That's the point. So it's a very unusual constraint. It may be there. I'm not denying it. But it's still an open question, and it does seem like they may bind if you look at parameter estimates that are in the literature. But there still is an enormous question about exactly what the nature of the constraint is, and whether that's really the binding constraint in many, many different societies. And so if we introduce income uncertainty, which I've abstracted from just for simplification, the constraints are playing a dual role. They reduce investments in the constraint. If they bind, they reduce investments in the constraint period. There's a precautionary savings motive. And because future income is uncertain, the likelihood of future binding constraints is uncertain, and that's going to actually bind. So there's a role for insurance markets, there's a role for opening credit markets. But the recent literature has been expanded tremendously. I've given you the bare bones model. I've wasted too much time on it, really, compared to where the exciting margins are. What's happening in the recent literature, instead of focusing only on investment in goods, investment in parental time, amazingly, has been omitted. It's partly because there are no data, and partly because time constraints, time data are now available. But when we incorporate features of things like parental time, multiplicity of children, parents learning about technology, fertility, marriage markets, role of multiple parents, we get a much richer model of the family. So even take the case of credit constraints. We think we have highly educated parents. One of the gross interesting findings about more educated parents is that more educated women, especially, getting school, are actually postponing fertility. And part of that fertility then means then they postpone part of this problem of this binding credit constraint. The previous model was taking fertility as given. So now if fertility is a margin of choice, you can also explain some of the phenomena that we've seen about the dynamics of fertility within the life cycle. Multiple children play a very interesting role because, and as I want to show you in a second, those play a tremendous role in the sense that now there's a question of, should I invest in the most able child? Should I invest in the most efficient child? Parental time is playing a huge role. In fact, some recent work by Flynn, Del Boca, and Wiswall has shown that both mother's time and father's time, with father's time more important in adolescent years than mother's time and reversed in the early years, are playing very important roles. And the role of family income per se, once you condition on those time inputs, is playing a very minimal role. Cunha, in his work, and others looking at the Nurse Family Partnership Program have noted that parents themselves may not know this technology. Parental ignorance is not something to deny. Wesley Clare Mitchell wrote a book 100 years ago or so called The Backward Art of Spending Money. If you'd updated it, you would have written it, The Backward Art of Raising Children. And what we've actually seen is that there are a lot of people who really are genuinely ignorant about what the best practice is. And the reason why I say that is that when you give these people information, and some of this is not just, it's ignorance which you can document through experiments where you give people information, you can actually say they embody this information, they take it, they act on it, and you can actually see child improvements going on. So there's a very, very rich literature. So I don't want to trash the previous literature, but this frontier, this margin, I think, is where the excitement really is. I guess I'm not going to be able to show you the full appendices, but these would be posted at the website. Let me just go on to say that when you look at the evidence on the credit constraints, there's a lot of evidence on the technology capability formation. And again, the recent literature, only the recent literature, has put in cognitive and non-cognitive skills. And that turns out to be quite important empirically. Almost all the human capital production literature has been on cognition, test scores. A lot of questions that come up, just econometric questions. Test scores are arbitrarily scaled. Any monotonic transform of a test score is still a test score. So the meaning of these value-added technologies is in doubt. We've addressed some of those questions in terms of anchoring and real outcomes, and the anchoring matters. But the really important finding is that the non-cognitive skills have been introduced, and it makes a huge difference. And then accounting for the nonlinearity of the production function. Remember when I was talking about complementarity, that notion is fundamentally a nonlinear notion. And so the nonlinear econometrics plays a very important role in shaping what we can come up with from the non-experimental studies in learning about these. So I'll just leave that in passing. And I will simply talk very briefly about the evidence of credit constraints. There's a very big literature that shows family income matters for child outcomes. That's very well established. None of that tells you anything about family income constraints. It doesn't tell you anything about credit constraints. It says that family income matters. So one of the findings that Pedro Carnero and I found some 10 years ago, and Belly and Lochner find, and many people have found, is that if you look at dumb kids who have rich parents, they're more likely to go to college. But that by itself doesn't tell you anything. Is that going to be credit constraints? Or is that going to simply be that you really have a form of paternalism where basically rich parents are happy to spend money on dumb kids? For them, it's a merit good and consumption good. So we don't think of that as a credit constraint. The literature, even though there's a very vast literature, we summarize this, is extremely weak at actually identifying credit constraints. And if you look at the few econometric studies, and they really are few, so let me just talk about the summary on credit constraints. I would argue that yes, income matters, but a pure separation of parental resources into income flows, parental environmental variables, and investment is still being done. And I would argue strongly against what some people have taken from the Gatsby curve, that a pure income redistribution policy per se is going to be effective. We really want to understand the mechanism by which these things are created. And I think the literature, I'll give Tabor and Cameron, some of my own work with Carnero, and many other studies now in the literature, taken as a group, are showing that these credit constraints, if you look at least at education, and I'm looking only at the United States, I'm not talking about Peru in 1980 or some interior region, the Yucatan in Mexico today. I'm not going to argue that those constraints aren't real, but what I am arguing that a lot of the literature is focused on constraints which aren't that well documented compared to, I think, some of the other inputs. So what I would argue is the literature establishes the first order importance of child ability. That's important. And the importance of credit constraints actually in the developing countries anyway, the developed countries, is showing fairly weak effects. Let me just talk briefly about multiple children, though, which I think is an interesting area. So we know that there's work. So far, much of the literature has been looking at one child. It's convenient. We always write models that are convenient, but we have multiple kids, and there's a whole issue. So we have this work that goes back, I think, to Behrman, Taubman, and Wales back in the 1980s, where they were talking about the intra-family allocation of resources. And so what their question was they had a representation for the family, and we asked, how do we measure family welfare? So this is a convenient representation, which allows you to have like a Rawlsian version or completely efficiency-oriented inversion. So if sigma is equal to 1 in this representation, and V is some measure of child outcome, then basically what the family is interested in doing, if this is the utility function of the child, of the parents, is maximizing total output. So if you have a really bright kid, and that kid's very promising, put all your resources into the kid. On the other hand, if you have a model where sigma is basically down to minus infinity, and you're basically just you're interested in equality, then people would argue, what you might want to do then is invest in the dumbest kid, or at least try to at least do kind of a Rawlsian type of investment strategy. Well, all we do, and I'm going to skip this too much because it really just allows me to put the technology. So in the paper, we actually look at the structure of how this investment is going. And we point out that this dynamic complementarity gives you some way towards explaining why compensatory investments, which before were motivated primarily by these kinds of equality motives, may in fact even be economically efficient. So what I want to argue is that even if sigma is equal to 1, then, and if I in fact have this dynamic complementarity, and I'm not going to be able to develop it, I have what, 5 minutes left, 10 minutes left? An hour left? No, I won't, I promise you.
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. But what I want to argue is, this is now just going to be an assertion, but we have these two technologies for each of the two kids, and the early and late. So even within the family setting, the disadvantaged child, it may be economically efficient to invest in the least able, and in that way, making later life investments more efficient, and that can actually be a solution. So we actually solve this problem out. I won't go through the full details, but I would just point out that if we look at the ratio of early to life investments, it's partly a matter of what the diminishing returns are in total technology. But what it turns out to be is that if the least endowed child is the one that's dashed, that you might have relatively more investments in the least endowed child, even if sigma is equal to 1, precisely on efficiency grounds. Then you can add these other motives as well, which we really don't know. Now, there's a lot of exciting work on this as well. There's a postdoc in Chicago who's also talking about another mechanism whereby parents are investing in children to build altruism. So another way, another mechanism, instead of investing directly in the dumb kid, is you invest in the smart kid, but make him feel very guilty about his status, and so by creating guilt in that. So there are a lot of other stories that might be created. So I don't want to do this. So let me just talk briefly about, in the time I have, about testing and operationalizing the theory. And here what I want to argue is there's a very rich econometric set of issues. And so I want to talk about capabilities as determinants of functionings. And so we think about this as vectors. So here we're going to enter a world where we think of these capabilities as these capacities that are out there. These are like sin-type capabilities, at least in terms of abilities to function. And these are combined with efforts and incentives. So the key idea is really this busy-looking equation where I look at functionings. Like this would be performance on the job. This could be like how well I do in an IQ test. This could also be how well I succeed in almost any task, including interaction with my peers. So I'm thinking of functionings in a very broad way. That depends on these capacities. It depends on the effort people bring to the task, and it also depends on things like purchased inputs. So we actually see that those functionings are essentially what's generating the capacities of individuals to succeed in life. So that puts it all together. But this already has some, and then effort itself, of course, is going to be a function of what people see as the perceived reward, the efforts in the environment, and the like. So what this leads to, so I would give a very simple application of this, which may sound counterintuitive. I would argue that one of these functionings is taking a test, like an IQ test or an achievement test. So they can say, okay, we know actually, and this is something that people have to think, well, what's IQ? Well, IQ is a score on a test. How do you score on a test? A score on a test depends not only on your true ability, but how motivated you are at the time you're taking the test. And that turns out to be, and that's been very well documented in experiments. People have come along and said, oh, I've incentivized individuals. So you give very disadvantaged children incentives to do well on an IQ test. You can eliminate IQ differences for that particular test. So almost everything in life consists of these multiple traits and it leading into inputs. That creates a huge econometric problem, but it also creates a deeper understanding. So let me just talk, if I can, like a few minutes on just what the maps are, estimating and interpreting the distribution of capabilities and what we might find out. So I want to argue that non-parametric factor models, these are state space models for those people familiar with the state space literature, but non-parametric versions are natural frameworks, and they've been developed in the literature and even applied. And what was been found so far, and it's an area that's unfolding, we have lots and lots of measures on people. But so far, we found that fairly low dimensional representations of these capabilities generate a high dimensional set of functions in this sense. And so there are a lot of methods underway, Bayesian model selection questions, Bayesian methods for selecting the dimension of the factor. So there's huge literature, of course, in state space methods, but these are like nonlinear studies. Why? Because the output equation, this technology equation, if we want to allow for complementarity, fundamentally incorporates technology. So I'll just say, well, that's the kind of technology we want to estimate, and we have issues about the fact that measurement error can be extreme on these inputs, and we have to worry about using test scores per se as a measure of outcome, because test scores themselves don't mean anything, and so we need to question anchors and the investment itself. So I know there's a huge literature, probably by some in the room, looking at the effect of value added or what the effect is, and I can only tell you that based on this work here, if you don't anchor, if you don't really, you can get wildly different results. I mean, any monotone transform, you can just use quantiles, use any monotone transforms of quantiles. 3 minutes, okay, fine. So let me just kind of summarize then. So there's a lot of literature on extracting these. These dimensions are shown to be important. We get a lot of functioning, a lot of these functioning capabilities. And these low dimensional factors are the same traits are predicting crime, wages, health, healthy behaviors, trust, voting behavior, employment, participation, and welfare. So it's really a broader sense. It's not just IQ on education. It's these capabilities are producing this opportunity frontier, this frontier production analysis. So let me skip over the technology and say, well, there's a lot of evidence on emerging dynamic technologies, so I'm going to have to skip a lot here. Just to say that what we've learned then, okay, let me just conclude with this one notion here. Let me conclude with one notion, so as I have, all I would say is that there's experimental evidence and there's non-experimental evidence. So there's a lot of work being done, and the experimental evidence lines up with the non-experimental evidence. So for example, if you look at something like the Perry Preschool Program, a group of us published this paper, just came out in AER, where we actually see that what was the main mechanism by which the Perry Preschool Program, an intervention targeted towards three-year-old kids, followed for their lifetime, and are now being followed up to age 50, some randomly assigned to treatment, some control. What we found is the main mechanism was basically improvements in these non-cognitive skills. And it contributes to virtually all of the treatment effect. So there's a non-trivial issue about that. Second, though, when we look at what the deeper understanding is, and here I'll just conclude with this, because I think this is the important thing. So when we sort of abstract from all of these studies, so we have lots of econometric details, we have lots of things going on, but what I want to argue is when we start looking at what the effective programs are, the effective interventions, many people sort of look at this in a very narrow way. They say, here's a program, I want to randomly assign people to evaluate that program. I have nothing against random assignment or anything of the sort. But what I want to think is when we look at a lot of these different interventions, random assignments and non-random assignments, what we really are starting to understand is this mechanism by which this parental influence is transmitted. And what seems to be very important is something that hasn't received its attention, which wasn't yet in that literature that I put on, which is this notion of interaction between the parent and the child, something that the child development people call attachment, engagement, and so forth. So when we look at effective studies and ways to intervene in the life cycle of children who are 17 years of age and are very disadvantaged, we found that mentoring programs that actually lead to this kind of attachment, interaction, one-on-one, are quite effective. They're actually quite effective. So it's not all early childhood. I know I'm associated with that, but that's, life moves on. And, but so there is another notion of mediation. If you look at the early childhood program, what's going on? It's not a particular curriculum. It's not like Baby Einstein. So when we start looking, we had a group that met together this last summer in Chicago. We had all the original Perry preschool teachers with the original ABC people and some of the early interventions. We said, and what came out of that, which stunned me, and I think it's extremely important, and that is that what we found was in the end, all the successful programs had a common theme within them. It wasn't like there was this curriculum that was superior to that. ABC met 8 hours a day, Perry 2.5 hours a day. ABC, stripped to its essence, met 2.5 hours a day with almost doing the same things that Perry was doing. And what were they doing? And here's where I'm going to lead. So here I am. This sounds like I've gone off the deep end. You say, I'm no longer doing economics. So here it is. No, but it isn't. I mean, this is common sense. You know, don't forget, the Freakonomics a few years ago said, never trust your common sense. I argue, at least in this, you truly want to trust your common sense. So John Dewey, who was a very famous educator 100 years ago or so, said successful schools do what successful parents do. I would argue that the recent analyses, if we look, for example, at all of these interventions, is basically that successful interventions promote capabilities at any age do what successful parents do. And so we actually document that. I mean, I could show you lots of other things, but this is just one example. Like in the parenting program of the Perry preschool program. So you had parental visits, and you see that those who were in the treatment group had much greater belief in this sense of parenting. If you look at many different measures of parenting. ABC didn't have home visits, Perry did, and yet you still see similar responses. And so in a lot of work, and what some of what Flavio's doing, and some of the work in this family partnership program and so forth, that there is a consistent finding that this parent, and that suggests a very, so I'll just lead to this, I'll skip everything here and basically just summarize. So what I want to argue, and this sounds like it's really touchy-feely, but it's not. It's really models of interactions that matter. Dynamic interactions between parent and child, dynamic interactions, and we actually are building models of that sort. And so when we look, for example, at what a successful model of this is, it's much more like the child, in the literature of child development, they call it scaffolding, but it's like a child being tracked by the parent. I don't mean being tracked in the sense of, you know, monitoring and having a drone fly over the child. What I really mean is interacting with what the child is, where the child's at, and creating a set of investments that are, and that's the theme and interventions that kind of give the child the next step, but don't push it too far, and don't bore the child. And that's the successful criterion in virtually all of these programs. See, that's not a standard curriculum. And it's not, and I would argue that every intervention that I've seen that's been successful, whether it's in adolescent or early childhood years, has had this. So let me just summarize. Understanding what life cycle policies is very important. I think we overestimate the role of family income. I think we have a lot more to understand, but I don't think it's a simple matter of income redistribution. One anecdote I will give is that in the US, we had these families that were in extreme poverty. And so if we looked at the social mobility index, we would predict with probability approaching 1, these people their children should never get out of poverty. 50 to 60% of those kids got out of poverty. What was the recurrent theme about how they got out of poverty? It was consistent parenting. It was basically conscientious parents. Even though the parents weren't that educated, they were providing consistent interaction with the child. And that plays a very important role. And I would argue that that causes me, anyway, to rethink it. So basically, understanding that formal education is only one of many skills, understanding these capabilities, and I think we have to move beyond this notion of inequality and just simple income redistribution. I think we really want to think much more about the mechanism of the family. And as we start understanding the family, and we start understanding what the mechanisms are, it's not just a question of perfecting loan markets. That could possibly make a role. My guess is that it's much more understanding this kind of imperfect knowledge about parenting. There are a lot of people, I mean, I'm a former parent. I guess I'm still a parent, but a former in the sense that I played, and we played it by ear. And the story, I'll just conclude with the story. And you know, when my first kid was born, I got very concerned. I said, I should read the child development literature. So I was reading Piaget, I was reading everything. And I said, it should be very good. I was telling my wife we should really follow these teachings of, and then basically she said, throw this crap out. What we're gonna do is basically wing it, play it by ear. And I think that's what is there. These common sense ideas are there. So I don't want to suggest there isn't a role for analysis, but I think there is a role for common sense. And I think in this case here, I have now some solid evidence that that's actually going on. But it's a frontier. I wish I could tell you this is all settled. So no trips to Stockholm based on this, I promise. It's very, very, and I'm sure many people would disagree, and I'd like to hear that disagreement. But I also think that it's a very challenging area. And there are models. Marco Conscanati, there's a great paper by Akabayashi, where literally you see the fact that the parent and the child are interacting in a dynamic way. Those dynamic interactions can be modeled. There's a framework now of an emerging econometrics that's doing it. And I see that as much more than this kind of static model of, the old, like investing in the child is investing in the firm, something, well, that's it's a paradigm there, but it's much more interesting to think about this dynamic interaction. So thank you very much for your patience, and I would like to get some questions.
Thank you. Do you have time for one question, perhaps, or?
One question?
No?
No questions?
Okay, it says there's no time for questions. Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.